Thank you very much. I'm James Fowler. I'm a professor at UC San Diego, and I want to talk to you today about a book that I've written with Christakis called Connected: The Surprising Power of Our Social Networks and How They Shape Our Lives. Now, you hear social networks these days, and what do you think of? You think of Facebook, you think of MySpace, you think of Twitter. But we are interested in the social networks that actually came before this internet revolution made us so aware of them. If you think about it, we've always had friends. We've always had family members. In fact, part of what makes us human is the fact that we live in these webs of humanity, where we make a simple, fundamental choice. And that fundamental choice is whether or not to become friends with somebody, whether or not to seek someone as a spouse and to become a spouse with them. A pair is the simplest kind of social network that you can imagine. Two people, two circles in one of our social network maps with a line in between them. Now, the remarkable thing is that when each of us makes all of these different choices about who we're going to connect to, what we get is we get an agglomeration that makes this beautiful structure that's complex and ubiquitous and has a form that is the same from one network to another network to another network. And this leads us to ask the question, how do these networks form? What is their purpose? And how do they affect us? Well, we've come up with a number of different research findings that we've tried to simplify in our book in a number of rules. We've got 5 rules that we think can help to simplify how we think about these social networks. So the first rule is we shape our networks. And that's what this diagram displays. Each one of these lines, each one of these is a choice about who we bring into our network. And we even have a choice about whether or not other people are friends with each other. And so if you think about it, for example, you can introduce a new friend to all of your other friends and make a very dense network around you. Or maybe you're the kind of person that wants one friend from this group and one friend from that group. Like the George Costanza rule, we don't want worlds to collide. And so we make these choices every day. We shape our networks. But our networks also shape us. That's rule number 2. And so when we are actually seeking out these people, for example, when we're trying to find Mr. and Mrs. Right, it may seem like a daunting task. Even if you're an optimist and you think there are 1 million people out there who could be Mr. and Mrs. Right, there are 6 billion people in the world. So how many dates is that going to take? That's going to take about 6,000 dates. Now, how on earth are you going to search through 6,000 people? Well, the surprising power of our social networks is that they bring us into contact with those people through a series of direct relationships. If you have 20 friends, and each of them has 20 friends, and each of them has 20 friends, that's 20 times 20 times 20 is 8,000 friends of friends of friends. And so now we are in touch with personal information on a wide range of people, and all we have to do is just make friends ourselves and talk to the friends we have now about the people that they know. And in fact, this is an extraordinarily effective way for us to shape our new networks. In fact, according to the Chicago Sex Study, about 2 in 3 of you who are married met via someone who was as close to you as 3 degrees of separation, through a friend of a friend, or a friend of a friend of a friend. And so these social networks help us to get in contact with those people, those rare people out there who are just right for us. But we're also interested not just in the way these networks are shaped, but also in the way they affect us, in what flows through these networks. And so Christakis and I have been very fortunate to find a resource in the Framingham Heart Study that we never imagined we could find. For the purpose of just keeping people in the study, they were asking people for 32 years, who are your family members? Where do you work? Where do you live? And most importantly, who are your friends? And we were able to utilize this information for the very first time to see these huge, vast networks, not just looking at what happens to you, but what happens to your friends and your friends' friends and your friends' friends' friends as well. And so I want you to think for just a second. Do you even know who your friends' friends are? How about your friends' friends' friends? These are people that you might have run into at a party, but are these people that you could even name? Are these people that you're aware of? For the first time, now that we have data like this, we are able to get a bird's eye view of networks like the networks that you live in. And we're able to see what happens to you and how that affects what happens to other people. And so the very first thing that we studied was obesity. We were very interested in this epidemic of obesity because we were curious to see, was it not just an increase in prevalence, but was it spreading like the flu from person to person to person? And what we found when we mapped this network was that we were able to see clusters in these relationships. So just to give you an idea, in one of these maps, a circle is a person, a line is a relationship between them, and in this particular map, we made the nodes bigger if they had larger body mass index. And we colored the largest nodes, the nodes over 30 BMI, yellow to indicate which are obese. And we can clearly see that there are clusters of normal weight people and clusters of obese people. Okay, so that's the first stage that you would want to find in one of these maps if you thought that one person's health behavior was influencing another. But it's not definitive. There are lots of different reasons why you might find clusters in the network. One of them is it could just be a false positive. Maybe you just flipped a coin 6 times and got 6 heads. Right? So if I throw up randomly people being obese and not obese in a complex structure like that, then just due to chance, there are going to be some of those clusters where it looks like there are a lot of people who are overweight together and a lot of people who are normal weight together. Now that's easy to deal with because all we have to do is compare the network we observe to these simulated networks where we randomize who's obese and who's not. And we can tell you for sure that these clusters are off the charts in terms of not being something that's possible due to chance. The second possibility is that it's not the case that one person is influencing another, but it's people of the same type choosing to be friends with one another. And we call this homophily, which is a word that literally means love of like. It's this idea that we choose to be friends with people who are like us. And so in order to deal with that problem, what we need to be able to know not just what's happening to you now, but what was happening to you when you made friends with the person in the first place. And this is the advantage of having data over 32 years. You're able to actually take that into account. Now, the third thing is that you might have contextual effects. You might have things in your environment that are causing your obesity and your friend's obesity to go up and down together, your weight and your friend's weight. And so the way that we are able to deal with this is by taking advantage of a very unique property in the network, which is that sometimes I name you as a friend, but you don't name me back. And so when we look at all of these relationships, what we would expect to find is that the people who named the friend are going to be influenced by the person that they named, but not the other way around. And so in this way, we're able to get from observational data some limited evidence that there's a causal relationship. And if that's the case, then what we have left over is this influence effect that one person's health behavior is actually influencing another person. And so just to give you an idea of what this looks like, this is a movie over 32 years of these relationships. You're going to see people getting larger over time, which was consistent with what was happening in the United States at the time when we went to about 10% to about 1/3 of the population being obese. You're going to see people forming friendships and getting married as lines form between nodes. You're going to see lines breaking as people get divorced. You're going to see nodes disappearing as people die. And you're going to see lots of different clusters form in the network as one person becomes obese and a person who's connected to them becomes obese and a person who's connected to them becomes obese. And it's this kind of view of the human superorganism that has really started to change the way we think about ourselves as human beings. We are connected. We are connected in ways that these other social species are, like schools of fish and flocks of birds. And this is really something that we need to start taking into account when we think about our health behavior. Now, some of what we found was that when one person becomes obese, it increases their friend's chance of being obese by about 57%. If the people were mutually naming one another's friends, it almost tripled their risk of obesity. Now, we didn't find that there was an effect for the person who was named as a friend on the person who was naming them, which is exactly what we would expect if there was an influence effect rather than just a contextual effect. We also found different varieties of relationships had an influence. So spouses had an influence, and also siblings had an influence. But most importantly, immediate neighbors did not have an influence on one another. And the reason why that's important is because this is a fact that was quite missed by the media. And so just for example, what's wrong with this picture? Homer Simpson is not your friend. So he can't make you fat. What our particular study has shown is that it's only these deep, close social relationships that have an impact. It's not going to be sitting next to someone on the bus and catching obesity like cooties. This is about changing people's behavior. This is about paying attention to your friend when you see them and finding out what they're doing to make their lives better. These lifestyle changes are so important. Another misconception is that if you have an obese friend, that you should get rid of them. We saw this kind of cartoon all the time. And in fact, we went back to the data and looked at the 1,000 cases in Framingham where people had a friend who became obese, and we divided them into two groups. There were the people who remained loyal to their friend, and there were the people who dumped their friend. And guess which group had the higher risk of obesity? The dumpers had the higher risk of obesity. So although when your friend undergoes a change, it has a strong effect on you, the fact that you have a friend is so important that you cannot possibly take from this study or from any other study the advice that you should get rid of any friend. Every friend makes you healthier. Every friend makes you happier. And that's a point that we have said over and over again, but it gets lost sometimes whenever it's transmitted to other people. This cartoon actually gets it right. And so this is Kathy, which is shocking that these individuals got it right, but they sat down and they feel a little anxious because they hear that weight gain is spreading from person to person. But their reaction is, when the waiter comes up, oh, she'll have a dry salad and a glass of water. And this conveys this idea that if you want to achieve healthier lifestyles, that you can't just do it alone. You have to get your friends and family involved. You have to acknowledge the fact that you're connected. And that this rule of the social network, this third rule of social networks, that friends affect us, is critically important if we want to make a positive change in our life. Now, we've also shown that this is true for affective states, like happiness. And so you notice here what we have is we have a cluster of happy people, these yellow nodes in this network. And we also have a cluster of unhappy people, which appropriately are colored blue. And we've done this for loneliness and also for depression. And what this finding is showing us is that it's not just behaviors that are spreading through networks, it's also these emotional states that are spreading through networks. And what's really important is that what we found in the behavior studies is that your friend who lives hundreds of miles away has just as big an impact on you as your friend who lives next door. Now that sounds a little puzzling, but if you think about the people who you really consider your close friends, you might not only see them but once a year, like maybe at Thanksgiving or at Christmas. But if you find out that they've just started exercising, or if you look at them and they look really great because they've lost a few pounds, that can have a really big effect on how you see yourself. And so we think that what's spreading is not this tendency to eat dinner together. It's not this tendency to go down to the bar together or to go smoking together. It's this tendency to transmit ideas, these norms of behavior, so that when you make your life better, you're actually making the lives better of your friends and family as well. We also talk about things besides health in the book. We talk about financial contagions. As it turns out, when people were making this run on a bank in England, first time they'd seen a bank run in over 100 years, a lot of the people that were interviewed, they didn't get out of the bank because they thought the bank would fail. They got out of the bank because they thought everyone else thought the bank would fail. And this has important implications not just for Northern Rock, but for the meltdown that we've experienced over the last year or two in our own economy. The people who do trading on Wall Street are not immune to this. They're human beings as well. And they have to make money as well and preserve money as well. And you can get these kinds of contagions. But you also can get positive things coming out of these financial networks as well. As Muhammad Yunus has shown us in his excellent programs that he's developed with the Grameen Bank in terms of lending small amounts of money to women and letting them use their social networks as collateral. We also find evidence of voting contagion. This is where I started my work. I'm a political scientist. I was really interested in how political behavior spreads from person to person to person. And there's now really good empirical evidence, experimental evidence, that when one person votes, it increases the likelihood not only that the next person votes, but that the next person votes as well. These person to person to person effects. And incidentally, that's my social network right there. We stood in line for a couple of hours the day of the election, and I was very happy to demonstrate this to my children. So, one of the things that we really want to emphasize is that these effects don't just stop at your social horizon, at the people you can see. Remember, I asked you to think, do you know who your friends' are? Well, one thing that we're finding in study after study after study is that your friends' have an impact on you. They're going to impact whether or not you're obese, whether or not you smoke, whether or not you drink, whether or not you're happy, whether or not you're lonely, whether or not you're depressed. This is all information that we've gotten from the Framingham Heart Study. They're also going to impact whether or not you exhibit altruism. Cooperation can spread in these networks. If you do a kind act to one person, they'll do a kind act to another person, and it will also spread up to 3 degrees of separation and no further. We've also got very interesting stories in the book about people who have studied inventor ideas and piano teacher referrals that have also found this property that your influence spreads 3 degrees of separation and no further. Now, why might that be the case? Well, one possibility is that influence just decays naturally, like a pebble in a pond, the ripples just eventually decay. Another possibility is that the network actually is different out at 4 degrees of separation from one time to another, because those people can be cut from you if any person breaks the ties between any one of those 3 degrees of separation. But the real thing that we're interested in is this evolutionary purpose idea, this idea that human social networks are in our nature. That really we have evolved in groups of about 150 people over the last hundreds of thousands of years or so. And if that's the case, then we wouldn't have lived in groups where we were separated by anybody at more than 3 degrees of separation. So we've actually started to take this evolutionary argument seriously by doing twin studies to see whether or not heritability, whether or not genes can explain some of the variation in people's social network structure. And we find that it does. Genes help to explain about half of the variation in the number of people who name you as a friend, about half of the variation in where you sit in the network in terms of whether or not you're central, like the life of the party, or whether or not you're peripheral, like a wallflower. But even more remarkably, it influences whether or not your friends are friends with each other. Because some people have the tendency that they want to introduce their friends to each other, and some people like George Costanza say, no way, I want to keep these people separate. And so this suggests to us that there are some important lessons that we need to take online as a result of the fact that we have grown up over hundreds of thousands of years in these social networks. So just to give you an idea, this is a picture of a real network in a dorm room of 105 close friendships. And we can add some other natural relationships. We can add the ethnic clubs memberships. We can add roommates. But now let's add Facebook. That's a very, very different reality. But what we're finding in our studies of Facebook is that actually all those Facebook friends don't make a difference. It's only your close social relationships that matter. So when we limit our studies to just people who upload pictures of one another, we get a map that looks like this. And what do we find? We find clusters of smilers, people who smile in their profile pictures, and we get clusters of non-smilers, people who don't smile in their posts. And this is exactly what we find in Framingham. We're also now looking at obesity online and trying to see whether or not it's possible not just to see these influence effects online, but whether or not it's possible to intervene and to help us spread these interventions from one person to another. And so let me just wrap up by saying that social networks really influence lots of things. They influence Broadway musicals. If I had more time, I would tell you about it. But they also really influence our ideas about ourselves. Okay, so here's someone who hears us say that you're affected by your friend's friend's friend, and how does he react to it? He's not going to try hard at all. And a lot of people, when they hear us tell this story, these huge effect sizes for how your social network affects you, their reaction is, well, that's the end of free will. I might as well give up. But that's not the way I think about this. I personally have reacted to this new evidence by losing 5 pounds and keeping it off. And it's because I know that I'm not just changing my own outcome. I'm potentially changing my son's life, and my son's friend's life, and my son's friend's mother's life. When I come home at the end of the day, I put on my favorite song, and I try to make myself a little bit happier for exactly the same reason. Because I'm not just taking care of myself. I'm taking care of all my friends and family, and their friends and family, and their friends and family. If you tell someone they don't influence anybody, they're not going to do anything. But if you tell them they influence 1,000 people, they'll change their lives. And that's why I think it's so critical for us to understand, first and foremost, how and why we are connected. Thank you very much.